The conference room on the 14th floor of Whitfield and Associates smelled like expensive leather and quiet contempt. I'd been sitting in the same chair for 40 minutes, while my son's soon-to-be ex-wife's attorney made a production of reviewing my financial disclosure forms. He held the papers at arm's length, like they might be contagious. "Mr. Briggs." He set the forms down and looked at me the way a man looks at a parking ticket. Mildly inconvenient. Easily dismissed. "According to these documents, you currently receive a federal pension of approximately $2,200 per month and live in a two-bedroom home in Decatur, Georgia, valued at," he paused for effect, $167,000. He let that number sit in the air. Across the table, my daughter-in-law's father, Gerald Whitmore, leaned back in his chair and straightened his cufflinks. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, and had the particular posture of a man who'd spent 4 decades being told he was the smartest person in every room he entered. His company, Whitmore Capital Partners, managed assets the size of small countries. His daughter's attorney, Harrison Blake, billed at $800 an hour. My son sat to my left. 34 years old, exhausted, 2 months into a divorce that was eating him alive. His attorney, a kind woman named Patricia Osei, who'd taken his case at reduced rate, was doing her best. But you could see in her eyes that she understood the math. Whitmore Capital's legal team against a man who fixed HVAC units for a living. "I'd like to enter this into the record," Harrison Blake continued, "as evidence of the Briggs family's overall financial position. My client's father, Mr. Gerald Whitmore, has offered to assist with his daughter's transition, which is more than we can say for the paternal side." He glanced at me, smiled. "No offense, Mr. Briggs." Gerald Whitmore chuckled softly. I'd heard that chuckle before. 3 Christmases, 2 Thanksgivings, and a birthday party where he'd introduced me to his business colleagues as Daniel's father, the government man. Said with the specific inflection that meant, "not important." I looked at Patricia and gave her a small nod. "None taken," I said. Harrison Blake looked satisfied. Gerald Whitmore refilled his water glass. My son stared at the table. Nobody in that room had any idea what was about to happen to them. "My name is Walter Briggs. My son calls me Dad. Most people in Decatur think I'm a retired federal employee who grows tomatoes and watches too much baseball. I drive a 2009 Chevy pickup with a cracked dashboard, wear the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation, and spend my Friday afternoons at the hardware store arguing about caulk guns with a man named Roy. What most people don't know is that for 28 years, I was a special agent with the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. My job was financial crimes, tax fraud, money laundering, embezzlement, asset concealment. I built cases against people who thought they were untouchable. I helped send a city councilman to federal prison. I was part of a team that dismantled a construction fraud scheme that had been operating in 3 states for 11 years. When I retired, my supervisor said I had the best nose for hidden money he'd ever seen in 3 decades of federal law enforcement. I retired quietly. No ceremony, no press, no LinkedIn announcement. I went home to Decatur, planted my tomatoes, and tried to remember what silence felt like. Then my son married into the Whitmore family, and silence became the most useful tool I had. Daniel met my daughter-in-law at a corporate fundraiser in Atlanta. She was beautiful, confident, the kind of woman who fills a room without trying. Her family's money was old enough to have its own mythology. Her father had built Whitmore Capital Partners from a regional investment firm into something that appeared, from the outside, like a legitimate empire. The word "appeared" is doing a lot of work in that sentence. I liked my daughter-in-law, in the beginning. She was sharp and funny when Gerald wasn't in the room. It was her father who made me uneasy, though I couldn't have told you exactly why at first. Just a feeling. The particular unease of a man who has spent 3 decades watching people perform wealth rather than own it. The first sign was the Hargrove account. I wouldn't have noticed it except by accident. My daughter-in-law had left her laptop open on the kitchen counter during a Sunday dinner. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for the charger to my phone. But the spreadsheet on the screen stopped me cold. Not because I understood what I was looking at, because I didn't, and that bothered me. In 28 years of financial investigation, I'd learned to read money flows the way other people read maps. And what I saw on that screen had the unmistakable texture of something that had been deliberately made to look complicated. I memorized 3 column headers and a company name. Took me until midnight to decide what to do with them. The next morning, I called the one person I trusted without reservation, Frank DeLuca. Retired IRS, same cohort as me, 25 years in financial crimes before he moved to the private sector doing forensic accounting for law firms. We'd worked 3 cases together in the 90s. He was the kind of man who returned every call and kept every confidence. "You're probably overthinking it," Frank said when I described what I'd seen. "Maybe," I said, "but I'd like to not be overthinking it. Send me what you have." I had almost nothing. 3 column headers and a company name. Frank called me back in 4 days. "Walter," he said. "My son's house." Silence on his end. "You need to sit down," he said. "And you need to decide, before I tell you anything else, how much you actually want to know." I thought about my son. About the way he'd looked at his wife at their wedding, standing at the altar with his whole face open and unguarded. I thought about my 2-year-old granddaughter, who called me Pop-Pop and fell asleep against my shoulder at family dinners. "Tell me everything," I said. Whitmore Capital Partners had a problem. Specifically, it had a problem that had been growing quietly for 6 years, buried in subsidiary accounts and management fee structures that were designed to confuse rather than inform. Gerald Whitmore was a talented man who had spent the better part of a decade siphoning investor money through a series of shell companies with innocuous names. The operation was sophisticated. It was also, when you knew what to look for, not as invisible as Gerald believed. Frank and I spent 4 months mapping the structure. We worked evenings and weekends, communicating through encrypted email, meeting in person at a diner off I-285 that neither of us had ever visited before and never visited again. What we found was worse than I'd expected. Gerald Whitmore had been defrauding his own investors, many of them retirees, pension funds, small family trusts, to the tune of what we estimated, conservatively, at $47 million over 6 years. My daughter-in-law, who managed the firm's client relations and had signature authority on several subsidiary accounts, had been signing documents that moved money through the structure. Whether she fully understood what she was signing, I genuinely didn't know. But her name was on the paperwork. I should have gone to the FBI the moment I understood the scope of it. That's what my training said. What protocol demanded. What any reasonable person would tell you. But I'd watched enough investigations go wrong to know what happened when powerful men got early warning. Gerald Whitmore had friends in Atlanta's financial community, political connections, a charitable foundation with his name on a hospital wing. Men like that didn't go quietly when tipped off. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses reconsidered their memories. Investigators found themselves reassigned or retired early. And my son's marriage was already fraying. By the time Daniel told me he and his wife were separating, I'd been building the case quietly for 8 months. The separation changed everything. Because now there was a child in the middle of it, and a custody arrangement being negotiated, and a team of Whitmore Capital's attorneys making sure my son understood exactly how unequal the fight was going to be. The first time I sat across from Harrison Blake, he looked at my flannel shirt and my cracked cell phone case and decided I was a non-issue. Gerald Whitmore barely looked at me at all. That was the moment I decided to let them keep thinking that. My son didn't know what I was doing. He knew I was supporting him, driving him to attorney appointments, watching my granddaughter on weekends so he could work overtime. He thought that was the extent of my involvement. One evening he sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee and looking at nothing. "Her father's people are saying they'll go for full custody if I push back on the asset division," he said. "Patricia thinks we should settle. What do you want to do?" "I want to not lose my daughter." I put my hand on his shoulder. "You're not going to lose her." He looked up at me. "Dad, you don't know that. I know more than you think." He studied my face for a moment. He'd known me for 34 years. He couldn't read everything, but he could read enough. What are you not telling me? A lot, I said honestly, but when this is over, I'll tell you all of it. He nodded slowly. Okay. That word cost him something. I could see it. My son, agreeing to trust me on nothing but my word. I didn't take it lightly. The timing had to be precise. That was the lesson from every case I'd worked. Rushing the evidence was how you lost cases. Gerald Whitmore's team was good. If I handed incomplete documentation to the FBI, a skilled defense attorney could create enough doubt to let him walk. Or at minimum accept a deal that let him keep most of what he'd stolen. I needed the case to be so complete, so thoroughly documented, that there was no room to maneuver. I also needed my son's daughter to be protected. Whatever happened to Gerald Whitmore, whatever charges my daughter-in-law faced, my granddaughter needed to land somewhere safe. I couldn't let the arrests happen while a custody battle was still unresolved, while a judge hadn't yet weighed in on my son's fitness as a parent. I needed to control the sequence. Frank and I spent the last 3 months before the mediation finalizing everything. 41 documented transactions, 11 shell company structures across 4 states and 2 offshore jurisdictions. Bank records, board meeting minutes, email correspondence that Gerald had apparently trusted to a server that wasn't as secure as he believed. 3 former employees willing to speak once they understood the scope of the federal investigation that was coming, regardless of whether they cooperated. 2 weeks before the mediation, I drove to Macon and met with a contact at the FBI's Atlanta field office, a woman named Supervisory Special Agent Renee Holloway, whom I'd worked with on a money laundering case in 2009. She was thorough, careful, and incorruptible. I put a hard drive on the table between us and told her to take her time. She called me back in 9 days. "Walter," she said, "where have you been for the last 4 years? We could have used this. I was growing tomatoes. This is airtight. I've seen federal prosecutors with fewer resources build smaller cases. I know. I need to ask you something about timing." She listened while I explained about the mediation date, the custody situation, my granddaughter. There was a long pause. "You're asking me to arrest the subject in a conference room in the middle of a family mediation proceeding? I'm asking you to coordinate the timing so that my son has emergency custody in hand before everything else begins." Another pause. "Give me the mediation date," she called back 3 days later. The warrant would be executed at the mediation. The family court judge handling the custody portion of my son's case had been briefed by the U.S. Attorney's Office as a courtesy. Given the circumstances, she had agreed to sign an emergency temporary custody order in advance, contingent on the arrest being executed as described. Everything was in position. All I had to do was sit in that conference room in my flannel shirt and let them underestimate me one more time. The afternoon of the mediation, I woke up before 5 and lay in the dark for a while. Outside, the Decatur neighborhood was still and quiet. I thought about the day Daniel was born, the weight of him in my arms, the way my wife had looked at me from the hospital bed, exhausted and luminous, and said, "Well, you're somebody's father now." She died of cancer 11 years ago. Pancreatic, fast and merciless. I'd held her hand through all of it and tried to be strong in the way she needed, and then I'd gone back to work because it was the only language I knew for pushing grief somewhere manageable. Daniel was the thing she'd left me. Her gift, forward into time. And now he was sitting across from people who were trying to take his daughter from him, using resources built on stolen money. I got dressed, flannel shirt, old khakis, the reading glasses I'd had for 9 years with the bent left arm. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. I was 63 years old, gray at the temples, a few more lines than I remembered, a little heavier than I'd been in my IRS days. I didn't look like anyone's idea of a threat. Good. I drove to the mediation, parked my pickup between 2 BMWs in the garage, rode the elevator to the 14th floor, sat across from Harrison Blake and Gerald Whitmore, and let them look at my flannel shirt and my cracked cell phone and decide I was nothing. And then I waited. Harrison Blake had been talking for 40 minutes when his associate stepped into the room and leaned down to whisper something in his ear. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. A certain stillness came over his face, the practiced composure of a litigator who'd just heard something he wasn't prepared for. He straightened up and looked at me. "Mr. Briggs," he said carefully, "could you state your full legal name and your most recent professional title for the record?" Patricia Osei looked at me quickly. I gave her the same small nod I'd given her before. "Walter James Briggs," I said. "Retired Special Agent, Criminal Investigation Division, Internal Revenue Service." The room changed. It's hard to describe exactly how, unless you've watched a room change before. It's not one thing. It's everything at once. The angle of someone's shoulders, the way a hand moves toward a phone and then stops, the quality of the silence. Gerald Whitmore set down his water glass very slowly. Harrison Blake's associate stepped back toward the door. "I'm sorry," Harrison said. "Could you repeat that?" "Walter James Briggs, retired IRS criminal investigation, 28 years of service." Gerald Whitmore turned and looked at his attorney with an expression I recognized from 28 years of sitting across tables from people whose world had just ended. It was the expression of a man running calculations and arriving at a number he didn't like. The door opened. 3 people entered. 2 wore the particular dark suits and measured movement of federal law enforcement. The third was Renee Holloway, in her FBI credentials and a gray jacket, carrying a folder under her arm. She looked at Gerald Whitmore. "Gerald Allen Whitmore," she said. My daughter-in-law's father looked up. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to defraud investors of Whitmore Capital Partners." The room erupted. My daughter-in-law screamed. Not a word, just a sound, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and involuntary, from the place where a person keeps the version of their life they believed was real. Harrison Blake was on his feet immediately, citing rights, demanding documentation, threatening injunctions. Gerald Whitmore sat completely still for 3 seconds and then began saying no, quietly and repeatedly, like a man trying to argue with gravity. They cuffed him at the conference table. I watched them do it and didn't look away. My daughter-in-law turned to me. Her mascara was already running. She looked the way I'd looked, I imagined, standing in a hospital room 11 years ago, like someone had taken the floor out from under her. "You did this," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was almost a question. I didn't answer. My son reached over and took my hand, squeezed it once. He was crying, which I hadn't expected. Not from grief, I thought. From something more complicated. The release of a weight he'd been carrying for 2 years. Patricia Osei's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, looked up at me, and for a moment she just stared. "Daniel," she said quietly, "the family court judge has signed an emergency temporary custody order, effective immediately." She looked at my son. "Your daughter comes home with you tonight." Daniel put his face in his hands. The drive to his daughter's daycare took 20 minutes. We went together, my son and I, in my old pickup with the cracked dashboard. He didn't say anything for the first 10 minutes. Just watched the Atlanta suburbs roll past the window. "Dad." "Yeah. How long?" "About 2 years. He was quiet again. "Did you know the whole time? When the separation started?" "I knew something was wrong before the separation. I didn't know the scope of it until later." "And you didn't tell me?" "I couldn't. If you'd known, you might have changed how you acted around them." "They were watching, Daniel. These people were careful. If they'd suspected for one day that someone was building a case, it would have been gone. All of it." More silence. "You spent 2 years," he said. "While I thought." He stopped. "I thought you were just showing up, driving me places, watching her on weekends. I thought that was all you had to give me. That's all I wanted you to think." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. "Pop, Pop," my granddaughter said when we walked into the daycare and she saw me. She was 3.5 now, sturdy and serious, with her father's eyes. She ran to me with the absolute confidence of a child who has never once considered the possibility of not being caught. I picked her up and held her and closed my eyes for a moment. Over her shoulder, my son was watching me. He looked like he was seeing me clearly for the first time in a long time. Maybe the first time since his mother died and I went back to work and neither of us said what needed to be said about any of it. "McDonald's?" my granddaughter announced. "Obviously," I said. The trials were not quick. The federal case against Gerald Whitmore moved through the system with a deliberate, methodical weight of 41 documented transactions and 3 cooperating witnesses. His legal team was expensive and skilled and fought every piece of evidence with everything they had. It wasn't enough. The paper trail Frank and I had built was exactly what I'd intended it to be. A structure so complete that attacking one section only illuminated the others. Gerald Whitmore was convicted on 19 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 14 years. He was 62 years old. The math was not kind. My daughter-in-law's situation was more complicated. The prosecutors offered her a cooperation agreement early. She took it, pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of conspiracy, testified against her father, received 3 years of supervised probation. No prison time, in exchange for a full accounting of every transaction she'd participated in. She and my son's custody arrangement was renegotiated with a mediator who did not work for Whitmore Capital's legal team. It was difficult. It took 4 months. But they reached an agreement that gave my son primary custody and his daughter a life that wasn't built on stolen money. My granddaughter asked me once, about 8 months after everything ended, why Grandpa Gerald had gone away. I thought for a moment about how to explain it. "He made some choices," I said. "That hurt a lot of people, and when you make choices like that, there are consequences." She considered this with the grave seriousness of a 4-year-old evaluating a philosophical proposition. "Like when I hit Marcus at school? Bigger than that? But yes. The same idea." She nodded slowly. "Is he sorry?" "I think so. I hope so. Will he come back?" "Someday. When he's done answering for what he did." She seemed satisfied with this. She climbed off my lap and went back to her drawing. Frank DeLuca came to visit the following spring. We sat on my back porch, drinking sweet tea and watching my tomatoes grow in the late April light. He'd lost a little weight since I'd last seen him. Retired life agreed with him in the way it agrees with people who've earned it. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said. "Tell me, that first call, when you described what you'd seen on that spreadsheet. 3 column headers and a company name." He shook his head. 28 years of financial investigation, and you made a case from 3 column headers." "It wasn't the headers," I said. "It was the structure, the way it was designed to look complicated when it was actually simple. That's always the tell. People who build fraudulent structures always overcomplicate them. Because they're not trying to make the money flow clearly. They're trying to make it flow invisibly. And invisible things have a texture." Frank smiled. "You sound like you're still on the job." "I'm not. You could be. Holloway called me, you know. The FBI would take you back in a consulting capacity. Financial crimes training, expert witness, case review." I thought about that. About office buildings and encrypted drives and the specific exhaustion of watching people destroy each other for money. "Maybe," I said. "Part-time, on my schedule." That's what I told her you'd say. My son joined us for dinner that evening. He brought his daughter, who fell asleep on the porch couch under a blanket I'd had since she was born. He and Frank talked for an hour about nothing important: baseball, Atlanta traffic, a restaurant that had opened near my son's apartment that Frank had apparently already heard about in Savannah. After Frank left, my son helped me with the dishes. We stood at the kitchen sink in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have said most of what needed to be said and are no longer afraid of what's left. "Dad," he said finally. "Yeah, I've been trying to figure out how to say something for a few months now." I handed him a bowl to dry. "Take your time. I spent 2 years thinking you were not useless. That's not what I mean, but small, I guess, compared to everything they had. Gerald's attorneys, and Gerald's money, and Gerald's connections. I kept thinking, what can my dad actually do? He's retired, he's 63, he drives a truck that sounds like it's in physical pain. What can he actually do?" He set the bowl down. "And the whole time," he said, "you were holding everything." I didn't say anything for a moment. "Your mother used to say that the quietest people in any room are usually the most dangerous," I finally said. She meant it as a compliment. He laughed, low and tired. She was right. She usually was. I handed him the last dish. He dried it and set it in the cabinet and turned off the faucet. "Thank you," he said, "for not telling me, for letting me think it was just the driving and the weekends. I don't know if I could have held it together if I'd known." "I know," I said. "That's why I didn't tell you." He nodded. Looked out the kitchen window at the dark backyard. "I want to be that for her someday," he said quietly. "What you were for me. The person who's holding things she doesn't even know need holding." "You already are," I said. "You just can't see it yet because you're in the middle of it." He looked at me. He had his mother's eyes, my son. He always had. "Get some sleep," I said. "Your daughter is going to be up by 6. He groaned and went to collect his sleeping child from the porch couch. I stood at the kitchen window for a while after they left. The backyard was dark, except for the porch light, which threw a long shadow across the garden beds. April was the best time for tomatoes in Decatur. Another 3 weeks and they'd be coming in faster than I could use them. I thought about Gerald Whitmore in a federal facility in central Georgia, beginning the long arithmetic of 14 years. I thought about his daughter building a smaller, quieter life and learning, perhaps for the first time, what money actually costs. I thought about 41 documented transactions and the investors whose retirement accounts had been quietly drained by a man in expensive cufflinks who believed that sophistication was the same thing as impunity. And I thought about what Harrison Blake had seen when he looked across that conference table at me. An old man in a flannel shirt, a retiree with a government pension and a 2009 pickup and nothing left to offer. I'd spent my entire career learning how to look like nothing. How to sit in rooms and be dismissed, overlooked, cataloged as harmless. It's the most valuable skill in financial investigation, and nobody teaches it. You either understand, instinctively, that being underestimated is an advantage, or you don't. Some people spend their whole lives fighting to be recognized. I spent 28 years learning to be invisible. There's a question I get asked, now that it's over. People who knew pieces of the story, Frank and Patricia Osei and a few others, they ask me if I regret the way I handled it. 2 years of silence. 2 years of watching my son struggle under the weight of something I could have ended faster if I'd been willing to risk the outcome. I tell them the same thing every time. I don't regret a single day of it. Not the evenings at the diner with Frank, tracing money through shell companies. Not the Sunday dinners where I sat at Gerald Whitmore's table and listened to him hold court and said nothing. Not the mediation where Harrison Blake looked at my flannel shirt and decided I was the least important person in the room. All of it led to one moment. My granddaughter running across a daycare floor toward me with her arms out, absolutely certain of being caught. That moment cost me 2 years. It was the best investment I ever made. My son thinks I'm a hero. I've tried to explain that I'm not. I'm just a man who learned, over a very long career, that the most powerful thing you can be in any room is the person everyone else has already dismissed. They stop watching you. They stop being careful around you. They start believing their own performance. And while they're performing, you're working. I'm 63 years old. I grow tomatoes in Decatur, Georgia. I drive a truck that sounds like it's in physical pain. I wear the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation and argue about caulk guns with a man named Roy on Friday afternoons. And if you ever find yourself across a table from me, thinking you already know what I am, please, keep thinking that. There's something I want to ask you, though, before you go, because it's the question I kept coming back to, through all of it, every quiet evening in my apartment with the encrypted drives and the cold coffee and the weight of what I was carrying alone. How far would you go for the people you love? Not the easy kind of far, not the phone calls and the showing up and the driving to appointments. I mean the kind of far that costs you something real. The kind that asks you to sit in a room and be nothing for as long as it takes, because the people at the table are not yet finished burying themselves. I went 2 years. I wore flannel shirts and nodded quietly and let powerful people believe I was irrelevant. And I would do every single day of it again without hesitation. If you know someone who's been dismissed, written off, told that they don't have enough, aren't enough, can't compete, Someone who keeps showing up quietly anyway, without explanation, without complaint. Pay attention to that person. They're the most dangerous person in any room they enter. They always have been,